The conference room on Terran Station smelled of recycled coolant and something older, something that Veth Olar associated with military facilities across 6 star systems, a flat, institutional mineral scent that no amount of climate regulation ever fully scrubbed out. He had sat in rooms like this one for 31 standard years. He knew exactly what they were for. They were for producing order from disorder, for reducing complexity to summary, for taking something unmanageable and making it manageable by writing it down in a numbered list and assigning it to someone with the appropriate clearance level. Veth Olar was very good at his job. He sat at the head of the long synthetic table, his 4 subordinates arranged along either side, their data pads glowing in the cool overhead light, and he looked at the door and waited for it to open. The briefing document on his own data pad described the subject of today's evaluation as a first contact specialist, 3rd grade human, name listed as Marin Solis, currently assigned to Outpost Keller's Rock on the outer fringe, secondment pending review. The review had been scheduled because of an incident. The incident was the reason the door on the far side of the room bore a new set of scratch marks along its lower frame, faintly luminescent under the station's overhead lighting, as if something with claws had been pressed against it from the other side and had dragged slowly all the way to the floor. No one had explained the scratch marks. Veth had not asked. He looked at his data pad, and then he looked at the door, and then the door opened, and the human walked in, and she was considerably smaller than he had been prepared for. Marin Solis was not what the incident report had suggested. Incident reports, in Veth's considerable experience, implied scale. They implied a certain weight to the individual responsible, a physical presence commensurate with the disruption caused. Solis stood 1.6 meters, which placed her at the compact end even for a human, and she was wearing standard issue station coveralls with a first contact patch on the left shoulder and a scuff of something dark and unidentifiable on the right knee. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was the particular variety of neutral that could mean either nothing or everything, and Veth had not yet spent enough time with humans to tell the difference reliably. She sat down in the chair across from him without being invited to, set both hands flat on the table, and looked at him with eyes the color of oxidized copper. She did not fidget. She did not check the room for exits, which struck Veth as interesting, given the nature of the incident. She simply sat and waited, and the chair did not scrape the floor when she pulled it in. The scratch marks on the door were 42 centimeters long. He had measured them himself that morning. He still could not explain them. First contact specialist Solis, he said, and she said, counselor. Veth Olar was the institutional review officer for the Galactic Council's Outer Fringe Authority, which meant that his title on paper was counselor, and his actual function was the productive management of situations that had become, in the Council's preferred terminology, non-standard. He had managed 37 non-standard situations in his career. He had never written the phrase in his notes without feeling a small, dry flicker of something he could not name. Non-standard. There was a word that did real work. You understand why you've been called in, he said. The Veth cool, she said. The sound in the room was the hum of the climate system and nothing else for approximately 3 full seconds. Across the table, one of his subordinates, a young Kaldrathi named Pris Vor, let her stylus rest against the surface of her data pad with a small click. The other 3 said nothing, which was appropriate because they had been instructed to observe and not to speak. Veth was aware of all of this at the periphery of his attention. The larger part of his attention was directed at the human across the table, who had just said the name of the entity in question with the same inflection one might use when referencing a piece of equipment with a known fault. Not dismissively, not casually, with the specific flatness of someone who had calibrated exactly how much weight to assign to a thing and had assigned it. "The Vethkul," he repeated. "That's what you're reviewing, isn't it?" she said. Not a question. He looked at his data pad. The incident report occupied 14 pages, which was unusual. Incident reports for routine outpost events rarely exceeded 3. The incident at Keller's rock outpost on the 14th of last month, he said, involved what our field personnel describe as a Class 7 predator organism, previously unclassified, approximately 4.2 meters at the shoulder when on all 6 primary limbs, possessing bioluminescent threat display, confirmed neural activity in the upper percentile range for apex predator cognition. He looked up. "It was inside your facility." "Yes," she said. It had breached the outer perimeter at some point during the previous 48 hours without triggering any of the standard proximity alerts. She said. "And when our evacuation team arrived to extract personnel and commence standard neutralization protocol, they found the organism in your common room." He paused. "Sitting." "On the floor," she said. "It doesn't fit in the chairs." I tried to explain that the chairs weren't going to hold it, but it kept looking at them. So eventually, I just moved 2 of them out of the way, and it settled down. Pris Vor set down her data pad entirely. Veth noted this with one eye while keeping the other 3 on Solis. At the far end of the table, the 4th board member, a Raxian xenologist named Sekt Har, who had not spoken since the review opened, made a small involuntary motion with his secondary appendages, the kind of motion that in Raxian body language indicated the recalibration of a prior assumption. Sekt was the only member of the review board who had actually read the xenobiological survey reports on OFX 7741 in full rather than relying on the incident summary. Veth had seen him make a note at the very start of the session before Solis even entered, and had not been able to read it from his angle. He understood now that the note had probably been something along the lines of, "This does not add up." "Specialist Solis," he said, "the entity you are describing is, according to every piece of documentation our xenobiological survey teams have produced in the 4 months since its first recorded sighting, a Class 7 apex predator that our modeling systems project would require a coordinated suppression team of no fewer than 16 individuals with heavy-grade equipment to safely neutralize." 18, she said. He stopped. The number sat on the table between them like a dropped instrument. "Your modeling systems use the standard outer fringe predator mobility coefficients," she said. "The Vethkul has a lateral movement range that doesn't get captured by those coefficients. 18 minimum, and they'd want to approach from the water side of whatever terrain they were working in, because it doesn't like crossing moving water. It'll go around." She tilted her head slightly, the copper-colored eyes level and attentive. "The name, by the way?" "Vethkul. I named it. I thought you should know that before we go further, because some of the documentation might refer to it differently. The survey teams called it OFX 7741. I didn't find that useful." Veth Olar was 62 standard years old. He had reviewed non-standard situations on 17 different worlds and 6 deep space installations. He had produced 214 institutional reports, all of them tidy, all of them conclusive, all of them resulting in outcomes that could be described as appropriate. He looked at the human sitting across from him in station-issue coveralls with a scuff on her knee and understood, with a clarity that arrived without fanfare, that this particular review was not going to produce a tidy outcome. "You named it," he said. "I named her," Solly said. "She's female. You can tell by the secondary ridge structure above the hindquarters, it's broader in females by about 30%. The males have a narrower profile and a different coloration on the threat display, more green than blue. I've only seen one male at distance. He was considerably more aggressive. She reached into her breast pocket and set a small, scratched notebook on the table. Not a data pad, a physical notebook with a soft cover, the kind Veth associated with human academics from archival footage. I have notes if the review board wants them. Behavioral observations, feeding patterns, the approximate range she covers. Social signals I've managed to isolate. I started keeping the notebook because the Outpost's datapad allocation doesn't include xenobiological logging as a standard category, and I didn't want to file it under general administration. "How long?" said Veth. She looked at him steadily. "How long what, counselor? How long has this been going on?" There was a pause. Not a hesitant pause, a measuring one. "She first came to the outpost perimeter about 6 months ago," Solis said. "She wasn't aggressive. She was investigating. I noticed the pattern in the proximity alert logs, the alerts that didn't register a physical presence but showed microfluctuations in the sensor field, the kind of fluctuation you get when a large thermal mass moves through the field boundary without triggering the threshold. Our sensors are calibrated for a standard threat weight profile. She's heavier than the calibration ceiling, which means the algorithm read her as sensor noise and discarded the data. I flagged it in my maintenance log." Pris Vor had picked up her stylus again and was writing very quickly. "You have maintenance logs going back 6 months showing sensor anomalies consistent with the organism's presence," Veth said. "Consistent with her presence," Solis said, and the correction was so gentle that Veth almost did not register it as a correction. "The logs are in the Outpost system. I can pull them remotely from here if you give me access credentials." She paused. "I assumed your team had already reviewed them." They had not reviewed them. Veth's team had reviewed the incident report, the emergency evacuation records, and the structural assessment of the breach point in the outer perimeter. They had not reviewed 6 months of maintenance logs because maintenance logs for a 3-person outpost on the outer fringe were not normally the kind of document that contained operationally significant information. He made a note on his data pad and did not comment on this. "Did not 6 months ago," he said. "What did you do when you identified the anomaly?" "Nothing, initially," she said. "You don't approach something you don't understand. You watch first. I set up a secondary monitoring array using the Outpost's maintenance sensors, the ones that run continuous ambient sweeps for equipment fault detection. Repurposed the data stream to feed into a pattern mapping program I wrote in the station's basic coding environment. It took about 3 weeks to get enough data points to start building a behavioral profile." She turned the notebook over in her hands, a small, unconscious motion. She had a pattern. Specific times, specific approach vectors, specific duration of observation before she withdrew. Always at the same 3 points along the perimeter. Always moving counterclockwise when she departed. I started recognizing the approach signature in the sensor data before she arrived. After about 5 weeks, I could predict her visits to within a 20-minute window. One of the other board members, a heavyset Solvati named Gren Cho, leaned forward very slightly. Veth felt this rather than saw it. "Specialist Solis," Gren said, his voice carrying the measured formality of someone choosing words carefully. "You are describing a period of 6 months during which you were aware of the presence of a Class 7 apex predator in the immediate vicinity of a 3-person outpost, and you did not file a threat notification." "I filed 2 maintenance reports," she said, "and a xenobiological anomaly note in the general log. The anomaly note referenced the sensor pattern and described it as a possible large fauna presence, requiring further documentation. It was filed at the end of month 2. A pause. Our outpost coordinator forwarded it to the regional administration office. I'm not sure what happened to it after that. The regional administration office received approximately 400 anomaly notes per standard month from outposts across the outer fringe. Veth was aware of this statistic. He was aware of it the way one was aware of a fact that had never previously required examination and had now become, abruptly, unavoidable. He looked at Gren Cho. Gren looked at the table. Orvas, who had worked in regional administration before moving to xenobiological classification, made a very small motion with one foreleg that Veth chose not to note formally. What the regional administration office had done with the anomaly note was, almost certainly, generate an automated acknowledgement, assign it a reference number, file it under General Fauna Sightings pending quarterly review, and proceed to the next item in the queue. This was not negligence. It was the entirely predictable outcome of a system designed to process 400 notes per month with a staff of 11, none of whom had been trained in Class 7 behavioral indicators, and none of whom would have had any reason to flag a maintenance sensor pattern note as operationally urgent. Veth made a note on his datapad. The note named 3 items: Administrative Triage Protocol Review, Outer Fringe Anomaly Classification Standards, and Priority Queue Thresholds. He would write that report later. It was not the report he was here to write today. "Walk me through the 14th, Veth said. Solis set the notebook down and folded her hands. By month 4, the behavioral pattern had changed. She was spending more time at the perimeter. The approach vectors shifted. She started coming from the east rather than the south, which put her closer to the facility's main entrance rather than the maintenance side. I interpreted this as increasing familiarity with the structure rather than a threat escalation. The threat display, when I finally saw it up close, is mostly acoustic and bioluminescent. She flares the display when something surprises her or when she's establishing dominance. I'd seen her do it twice at distance, once at what I later worked out was a rival predator passing through the region, once at a drone that one of our survey teams had flying overhead. In both cases, the display resolved within about 40 seconds and she settled. She looked at her hands for a moment. On the 14th, she came through the east side sensor array at approximately 0340. She didn't breach the perimeter the way our systems classify a breach, meaning she didn't trigger the pressure sensors because she went over the outer fence rather than through it. The fence is rated for a lateral load of 800 kilograms. She cleared it without contact. "She jumped it," said Pris Vor, who had been quiet for some time. "She stepped over it," Solis said. "Her stride length at full extension is approximately 6 meters. The outer fence is 3.5 meters high." A pause. "I heard her on the exterior sensors before she reached the entrance corridor. My colleagues were asleep. I got up. Here was where most institutional narratives, in Veth's experience, produced a decision point that the narrator found difficult to explain. Here was where the individual involved typically offered justifications, contextual factors, mitigating circumstances, a scaffolding of logic intended to make the subsequent action seem considered rather than, as it almost always was, some combination of training, instinct, and whatever peculiarity of psychology the individual in question had carried with them into the field. He waited. "I opened the entrance corridor hatch," she said. "I stood in the doorway." "You stood in the doorway," Veth said. She was at the end of the corridor about 12 meters away. The corridor lighting was low, red spectrum, night mode. The bioluminescent display was active. It lit up the whole corridor, blue-green, very bright. She was looking directly at me. The room's climate system hummed. Nobody moved, Veth was aware of his own ventral plates making a small involuntary adjustment, a pressure response he associated with information that his nervous system was processing faster than his conscious attention could follow. He did not look away from the human. "What did you do?" he said. "I said her name," Solace said. "I said Kess. That's the name I'd given her. I said it quietly, not in a commanding register, not as a recall command, just as a statement. Here you are. I know you. I've been watching you for 6 months, and I know the pattern of how you move, and I know what your display looks like when you're settling versus when you're escalating, and I know you've been watching me for 6 months too. And so here we are in this corridor, and I am going to stand here and not run, because you need to understand that I am not prey." She paused. "That's not what I said out loud. That's what I meant." Grencho said something under his breath in his native language that Veth's translator implant rendered as roughly equivalent to the human phrase, "Good Lord." Sektar's secondary appendages had gone still. Prisfor had stopped writing entirely and was watching Solace with an expression that in younger Kaldrazi, in Veth's experience, indicated the specific kind of recalibration that came from hearing something that reorganized prior information rather than adding to it. The fifth board member, a quiet Solvathi technician named Orvas, who had been brought in specifically for his expertise with the Class 7 classification protocols, had put down his datapad at some point in the last several minutes and had not picked it back up. Veth noted all of this without comment. The room had changed. It had been a formal review proceeding when it opened. It was something else now, a kind of space that formed around a particular type of account, the kind that was not entirely institutional in nature. She held the display for about 20 seconds, Solace said. Then it reduced. She made a sound, low register, sub-bass, something I'd been hearing at the edge of the sensor range during her perimeter visits, but hadn't been able to fully characterize. I'd written in my notes that it might be a contact vocalization, a signal used for non-aggressive proximity communication. It was. She was telling me she saw me. Solace turned the notebook over again in her hands. I said her name one more time. She came forward. Slowly, all 6 primary limbs, very deliberate, and she stopped about 2 meters from me, and she held still, and I held still, and after about 30 seconds, she lowered her primary sensory array. That's the cluster above the orbital ridge, the forward-facing sensory organs. Lowering it is a submission signal. The field survey teams missed that. It wasn't in any of the documentation because they'd only ever seen her in threat postures. A pause. I think she'd been trying to make contact for weeks and hadn't found a way in. Veth looked at the scratch marks on the door. 42 centimeters, luminescent under the overhead light, dragged from frame level to floor. The marks on the door, he said. She found the common room through the maintenance passage on the north side, Solace said. I guided her there after the corridor contact. There's more space in the common room. The corridor wasn't comfortable for either of us. She investigated the chairs. I moved 2 of them. She settled on the floor. A slight pause. The marks on the door are from when the evacuation team arrived at 0610. The emergency alarm was loud, and she flared the display, and she pressed against the door when she heard the movement in the next room. She wasn't trying to get out. She was trying to get between me and the noise. The word that arrived in Veth's mind at this moment was not a word he would use in an institutional report. It was too imprecise, too layered with connotations he did not entirely trust in himself. He set it aside and looked at his data pad and looked at his notes and looked at the woman across the table from him who had spent 6 months in the dark, watching a creature that his own modeling system said required 18 armed personnel to safely neutralize, and had spent those 6 months not with a weapon and not with a neutralization protocol, but with a soft cover notebook and a pattern mapping program built in a basic coding environment and a name. Specialist Solis, he said. What is your training background? She looked at him with the copper-colored eyes and said, I have a degree in comparative behavioral ecology from the University of Detroit. My specialization was apex predator social cognition. After graduation, I worked 4 years for a wildlife survey team in the Northern African Preservation Corridor, doing population assessment on large terrestrial predators, mostly ground-level solo field work. I joined the Galactic Council's First Contact program 8 years ago. A pause. I was assigned to the outer fringe because my supervisor at the time said my field methodology was, quote, inappropriate for standard diplomatic contexts. In what sense? Said Veth. She said I spent too much time watching and not enough time talking, Solis said. She was probably right, for her purposes. Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile. It turned out to be useful on Keller's Rock. Veth set his data pad down. He had been in institutional review long enough to recognize the shape of a personnel history that contained the wrong kind of competence, the kind that did not map cleanly onto any existing category, and so got routed to wherever the routing system had the least resistance. The Outer Fringe Outpost program was, in most institutional contexts, not considered a prestigious assignment. 3-person teams on the edge of surveyed space, minimal logistical support, low contact volume, administrative complexity that fell outside the standard workflow. It attracted people who were very good at being alone, very comfortable with ambiguity, and routinely undervalued by supervisors who measured output in interaction logs and diplomatic correspondence volumes. He wrote nothing on his data pad. He was simply noting privately that Marin Solis had been sent to the outer fringe because she was too patient and too quiet for the jobs that required talking, and that she had spent that patience on something that 4 months of xenobiological survey work had completely failed to approach. Pris 4 had been writing for the last several minutes without pause. Veth noted this and addressed her without looking away from Solis. Pris, what is the Council's current classification status for the Vethkul as a species? Uncontacted, Pris said without looking up. Class 7 predator, potential sapient cognition unconfirmed, contact protocol not initiated. Contact protocol not initiated, Veth said, and the phrase settled on the room like a thing with weight. She's sapient, Solis said. I don't have the instrumentation to produce a formal cognitive assessment, but the behavioral indicators are consistent across 6 months of observation. Goal-directed problem solving, pattern learning across contexts, what appears to be inter-individual recognition and social memory, deliberate communication attempts using vocalization and display. She learned that the red spectrum lighting meant the facility was in night mode. She timed her visits to coincide with it. That's not instinct. That's inference. She picked up the notebook. I have 140 pages of field observations. I know that isn't sufficient for a formal sapience classification. I'm not submitting it as a formal classification. I'm submitting it as the reason this review should consider contact protocol instead of neutralization protocol. Veth looked at Grencho. Grencho was looking at the notebook. Sektar was looking at neither of them, but at the space above the center of the table, which in Raxian body language indicated active internal processing rather than disengagement. With respect, Gren said, addressing not Solis but Veth, the protocol exists for reasons. Unsanctioned contact events introduce uncontrolled variables. If the organism has been building a behavioral model of this outpost and its personnel, it has also been building a behavioral model of the specific human it has interacted with. Removing Specialist Solis from the contact site does not necessarily produce the outcome she has described, It is possible the organism would accept a different contact officer. The behavioral profile doesn't support that, Solace said. She did not raise her voice. She did not look at Gren with anything other than the steady copper-colored attention she had been distributing evenly around the table for the last hour. Inter-individual recognition is one of the 6 behavioral indicators I identified. She knows me specifically. The sub-bass vocalization identified as a contact signal occurred in my presence and did not occur, according to the outpost's external audio logs, in the presence of either of my colleagues during the 2 months I tracked the perimeter visits. She was not approaching the outpost. She was approaching me. You cannot be certain of that, Gren said. No, she said. I'm not certain. I'm describing a 6-month behavioral record and offering my best interpretation of it. I'm asking for the opportunity to continue the record rather than end it. She looked at him steadily. The containment facility outcome is certain. I have read the incident reports from the 2 prior Class 7 containment attempts. Neither organism survived the first 2 weeks. If this is the first contact event with a sapient Class 7 species, the containment outcome is the end of the contact event. The field outcome is the continuation of it. Gren chose dermis did the involuntary flushing that indicated, in his species, the physical recognition of a logical position that had not yet been formally conceded. He looked at his data pad. He did not reply. There is, Veth said carefully, a standing protocol for situations in which outpost personnel have made unsanctioned contact with potentially sapient uncontacted species. Yes, she said. I know. The protocol calls for immediate quarantine of the contact site, restriction of the involved personnel pending review, and suspension of all further contact pending council authorization. Yes. And you are aware that under that protocol, this review board has the authority to order the immediate removal of the organism from the contact site and its relocation to a containment facility pending formal sapience classification. I'm aware, she said. I'm asking you not to. The air in the room was the particular air of a room in which several entities were breathing carefully. Veth set his datapad down and folded his own hands and looked at her. She was 34 years old according to her personnel file, and she had spent the last 3 of those years at a 3-person outpost on the outer fringe with what appeared to be a notebook and a very long patience. And she was sitting across from him now, in a room that smelled of recycled coolant, and asking him, without any indication that she expected to be given what she was asking for, not to relocate the creature she had named Kess to a containment facility. She was not begging. She was not threatening. She was simply asking, with the same flat precision she brought to everything else, in the full knowledge of the protocol, and the full knowledge of his authority, and the full knowledge that he might say no. On what grounds? He said. On the grounds that Kess came to that outpost, she said. Not because she was caught or herded or lured. She came because she chose to. She spent 6 months observing that facility and the people in it, and she made a risk assessment, and she decided on the 14th that she was ready to make contact. That's not the behavior of an animal. That's the behavior of someone who wants to talk and hasn't found the right language yet. She paused. The scratch marks on the door were her trying to protect me from what she perceived as a threat. You can relocate her to a containment facility, and she will be in a contained space with people she has never met, people who are not me, people who do not know that the sub-base vocalization means I see you, and not I am threatening you, and the outcome of that will be a fatality assessment and a formal neutralization recommendation within the first 72 hours, and we will have destroyed the first contact humanity has ever initiated with a Class 7 species before we even knew we'd done it. She was very still. Or you can send me back to Keller's Rock. Veth Olar looked at the notebook on the table. 140 pages of handwritten field observations in a soft cover notebook kept because the outpost datapad allocation didn't include xenobiological logging as a standard category. He thought about 31 standard years of institutional review and the 214 reports he had written, and the particular smell of rooms like this one, and the word non-standard, and what it meant when the thing that was non-standard was not, as it turned out, the situation, but the person sitting across from you who had been watching something other species ran from and had watched it long enough and carefully enough to be watching back. "The notebook," he said. She slid it across the table to him. He picked it up. The cover was soft and worn at the corners, the kind of wear that came from being carried in a pocket, taken out, referred to, put away again hundreds of times over months of dark mornings and red spectrum lighting and the sound of something very large moving in the corridor. He opened it to a random page. The writing was small and precise. There was a diagram in the margin, a rough sketch of a silhouette, 6-limbed, with annotations along the limbs and a notation at the bottom that read lateral extension when settling, compared to threat posture, page 67. He turned to another page and found a grid, rows and columns, dates in the left margin, approach vectors and duration times, and a column labeled display status with entries ranging from active full to active partial to none. And at the right edge of the grid, a column labeled other notes where the entries were brief and specific. Stayed longer than usual, came from south, watched maintenance drone with apparent curiosity, focalizations at 0445 duration, 11 minutes. He looked at the diagram for a moment, and then he looked at the human who had made it. "You understand that sending you back does not resolve the classification question," he said. "The formal sapience assessment will have to be completed through proper council channels before any contact protocol can be officially sanctioned." "I know," she said. "The process will take a minimum of 4 months, likely longer." "I know. And during that time, you will be required to maintain a contact log using the xenobiological logging format, which I am going to personally add to the outpost's standard data allocation, effective today." She looked at him for a moment. The copper-colored eyes were difficult to read, which he was beginning to understand, not because they were opaque, but because they expressed something his own species' emotional taxonomy did not have a precise word for. Patient certainty, perhaps, the expression of a person who had already lived 4 months of a process that had taken 4 months to earn, and was prepared to live 4 more. "Understood," she said. "Pris," he said. Pris Vor had stopped writing. She was looking at him with an expression he recognized, the expression of someone who had expected one outcome and had watched a different one develop, and was now recalibrating in real time. "Counselor, draft a preliminary contact notation for OFX 7741, flag it for Sapience Assessment Track, and add First Contact Specialist Solis as Primary Contact Officer of Record. Include the maintenance logs from the past 6 months as supporting documentation." "Yes, Counselor." He slid the notebook back across the table. Solis caught it without looking at it and returned it to her breast pocket with the ease of a motion performed many hundreds of times. "One question," Veth said, "before you go." She waited. "The name," he said. "Cass. Where does it come from?" She looked at him, and the almost smile was back, the expression he still could not categorize as threat or reassurance. "It's from an old Earth language," she said. "It roughly translates to 'she who watches.'" She left, without waiting to be dismissed. The door closed behind her without a sound. Gren Cho was the first to speak. He said to no one in particular, "How many of them are doing this?" Nobody answered him. It was not, as it turned out, a question that required an answer in order to be felt. Veth looked at the door for a moment and then looked at the scratch marks along its lower frame, 42 centimeters of luminescent trace from the claws of a creature that had pressed itself between a human woman and the sound of danger. And he thought about the phrase contact protocol not initiated and about 6 months of maintenance logs that had described, in the bureaucratic language of ambient sensor anomalies and equipment fault detection routines, the slow, deliberate approach of something that had decided a particular human was worth knowing. He thought about a soft cover notebook in a breast pocket. He thought about what it meant that she had named the creature before she had reported it, and that she had named it for watching, and that the creature had learned to time its visits to the red spectrum lighting, and had lowered its primary sensory array, and had pressed itself against a door. He looked at his data pad and wrote one sentence in his notes before closing the file. He wrote a recommendation to extend contact protocol consideration to all outer fringe outpost personnel with behavioral ecology backgrounds, cross-referencing Class 6 through 8 uncontacted organisms, flagged priority review. Then he sat for a moment in the room that smelled of recycled coolant, and outside the observation window behind the board table, the stars of the outer fringe were very bright and very far away, and he thought about all the things that were out there in the dark that had not yet been named, and about whether naming them first was protection or invitation, and decided, quietly, that it was probably both. 2 standard months later, a message arrived in his institutional inbox from Keller's Rock Outpost. Filed under Xenobiological Contact Log, Primary Contact Solus M, the message contained 34 new pages of behavioral observations, a preliminary notation on what appeared to be reciprocal communication attempts on the organism's part, including the isolation of 7 distinct vocalizations with proposed contextual meanings, and a postscript, flagged as personal correspondence, which read, "She brought something this morning. Left it on the outer steps. Looks like part of a bone, large prey animal, well cleaned. I've put it in the log under potential gifting behavior, designation social bonding attempt. Thought you'd want to know. Kess sends her regards." Probably. Veth read the postscript twice. Then he sat back in his chair, in the recycled air office that smelled like every institutional room he had ever occupied, and he made a sound in his chest that his colleagues would not have recognized as laughter because he rarely produced it. And he sat with it for a moment, and then he opened the xenobiological log and began to read.